San Francisco's Asian Art Museum, as part of its 2010 Shanghai Exposition, invited Leah Jacob Garrick to speak about her miraculous life growing up in Shanghai's Jewish community.
Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see such a big crowd. As Deborah said, the topic is what draws the audience. Shanghai, a miraculous life. Incredible as it may seem, the story of my life is true. I am a fourth-generation Shanghailander, and in Shanghainese, if anybody knows it today, Ala Zonghening Di Suder. I was born in Shanghai, as was my father, Leah Jacob. My grandparents and great-grandparents came there from Baghdad, and I believe you all know where that is. They followed the wealthy Sassoon family to Bombay and on to Shanghai around the latter part of the 19th century. This is a little-known chapter in Chinese Jewish history. It is a fascinating saga of pilgrimage and survival, and I feel compelled to relate the tale now with much reverence and loving memories, as I am the last generation to have been part of it. So why Shanghai? The Sassoon family, financial tycoons known as the Rothschilds of the Orient, left Baghdad for Bombay in the late 1700s due to the Farhoods, or pogroms in Arabic, which made life for the Jews untenable even then. They looked to the east to further extend their empire, and it was China that attracted them due to favorable trade and commerce opportunities, cotton, silk, tea, and of course, opium. The Iraqi Jews amassed fortunes as Shanghai began its meteoric rise. Iraq, many traveled to Bombay by sea to Shanghai. That was one route. There were three diverse migrations. I will talk about the Russian Jewish migration that came from Russia and crossed on the Trans-Siberian Railway north to Harbin and south to Shanghai. And then the third great wave were the European Jews that came from Germany, and also many crossed through Russia to Japan and then to Shanghai, and some came through the Suez Canal by ship. Most did the latter way. The Sassoons brought with them members of their community. My grandfather, his mother, two brothers among them. That's grandfather. And this was in the late 1800s. Today, Iraq's 2,600-year-old Jewish community, going back to Babylonian times, is totally decimated. Only a handful remain. 120,000 fled to Israel in 1952. So this is the beginning of my family life. Grandfather, we called him Jiddu, worked for David Sassoon's in the accounting department. They were Shomrei Shabbat, Sabbath observers, and the only offices closed on Saturdays in those days. Their books were kept in Judeo-Arabic, that is Arabic but written in Hebrew. He was also a scholar in Jewish law. Great-grandfather, Sasson Abraham, became the Hazan or cantor of the Beth Aharon synagogue, one of two Sephardic synagogues. We had to have one we didn't go to. And brought with him his wife and daughter Aziza, grandmother. She was the eldest of 6 and the only one born in Iraq. Granny said she was playing hopscotch one day when her father called her to the house to meet Jiddu, her husband-to-be. They were married shortly after and issued a civil marriage certificate by the British Consul General in 1903. It lists her age as 15 and a spinster. Jiddu was 33. Father was the eldest child of this union. He had 7 brothers and a sister. Mummy, Reva or Rebecca Soloduhan, known by all as Becky, was born in Simferopol, Crimea, Russia, the youngest of 6, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. She was only 9 months old when her family fled the Tsarist pogroms at the turn of the 20th century. They fled east via the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, Manchuria, and south to Harbin. Her parents. And they went on to Brisbane, Australia of all places, where she was raised and educated. As a young woman, after her father's death in 1917, she and her mother and younger brother returned to China to visit her 2 married sisters, and there met Dad. Mummy is on the left seated. It was love at first sight. Notice the spats on my father's shoes. However, Dad's father forbade the marriage, since my mother was Ashkenazi, and Dad, the eldest son of a prominent Sephardic family. For those who may not be familiar with the 2 terms, the word Sepharad is derived from the Hebrew meaning Spain, and also includes Portugal and Jews from the Middle East. And the Ashkenazi, those from Europe, Russia, etc. Some of the differences were in their observances, customs, definitely foods, and even Hebrew pronunciation. The Sephardic Torah scrolls were all encased in silver, golds, and velvets. Very different from the Europeans. But love prevailed, and they were soon wed. Theirs was only the second so-called intramarriage between a Sephardic and an Ashkenazi Jew in Shanghai. None of Dad's family attended his wedding. Her engagement, her mother, 2 sisters, Dad and Mom on the right, nieces and brother. None of Dad's family were there. They were not allowed to have any contact with him until I was born a year later. So I like to think that I was the cause of the family reconciliation. And I dubbed myself a Sephardic. Our family, at the dedication of grandfather's apartment building, called the Dufour Apartments, I'm standing there right in the center between grandfather and grandmother, Mummy and on the left, and my father behind her. And 50 years later, in the exact spot where I had stood. That's the Dufour Apartments. It had a huge metal menorah on the top corner, but it didn't exist anymore. Dad's younger brother, Uncle Isaac, who left before all this for London, and he was, pardon me, he was knighted in 1972 for his work in civil law. This is to recall the traces of that world and a bygone way of life, which took 100 years to evolve, for the fulfillment of a master plan, the miracle of which will unfold as I recount my tale. Shanghai, with a population of only 6,000 in 1840, grew from a village on the muddy flats of the Huangpu River to a thriving metropolis of 6 million in 1940, 1,000-fold in 100 years. Today, it's a bustling city of nearly 20 million and more than 400 skyscrapers, one of the densest in the world. China, with a population of 1.3 billion, will be in 20 years probably the greatest power on earth. The foreign chapter in the Shanghai saga had begun. The skyscrapers, the map of Shanghai. It was divided into 3 sections. One indigenous, here, a Chinese section. The south side was the French concession, and the rest was all the international settlement. And the European refugees, many of you may have heard the name of the area they lived in, Hongqiu, was across the Huangpu River in the industrial section of town. We lived on Yuyuan Road, which is right there, and later moved to Avenue Jaffa for those who may be familiar with the area. It was a cosmopolitan city. There were really 3 Shanghais. One indigenous, as I mentioned, the French concession, and then the British settlement, dominated by the British and governed by the Shanghai Municipal Council, established in 1854, wholly foreign-controlled, on which were representatives from several Western colonial countries, Britain and France among them, also Japan. No Chinese until 1928. They maintained their own police force and the SVC, Shanghai Volunteer Corps, which even had a Jewish company. The British won Shanghai as a treaty port in the Opium Wars in the 1840s. We lived lives of great panache. The wedding cake of one of my uncles, Dad and Mom and my grandmother, kid brother and aunt. 7 tiers. Another uncle had a wedding cake of 12 tiers. If you'll notice, there are some ribbons hanging from the bells. When they were pulled, 2 white doves would fly out. Extraordinary. It was only yesterday, after all, that Shanghai was known as the Paris of the Orient. That image of last fling decadence, of Shanghai dancing even while communism knocked on her door, survives in the minds of those of us who witnessed it and who will certainly never see its like again. No other world-class city in modern memory experienced a heyday so vivid and so brief. Missionaries declared that if God let Shanghai endure, he owed an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Only divine intervention could save her. Its very name was unsavory. Being shanghaied was a nautical term meaning to drug and ship as sailor when drunk. Strange that life following the 49 communist liberation had vanished almost overnight. The glory's gone, the glitter faded, the street names changed. The capitalists and all foreign residents fled. The bubble had burst. The Jewish community consisted of 3 separate and very diverse migrations that found in Shanghai a safe haven. These 2 ancient peoples who suffered much and survived had a great deal in common. Their reverence for parents, elders, family, education, and they both used the lunar calendar. We never experienced any anti-Semitism from the Chinese people. The world has much to learn from them. The Sephardic Jews, who came in the mid-1800s and numbered 500 to 700, were among the first to settle. Many, like the Sassoons, Kaduris, and Hardoon, who played a prominent part in the history of the community, made their wealth in real estate, banking, and of course, opium. Some were even knighted for their tremendous contribution to the British war effort. They built the Shanghai Jewish School, 2 beautiful synagogues. This was ours, the Beth Aharon, which unfortunately was demolished in the 1980s. Ohel Rachel, which is partially in use today. Here is the entrance as you enter the drive. The interior, marble. I think it was from Israel. And this is the private residence of the Kaduri family. It's 1 whole block, and if any of you have been to Shanghai, it's known as the Children's Palace today. The second migration from Russia in the early 1900s totaled 3,000 to 5,000. They trickled down from Harbin, and these are all rough figures. They were led by the highly esteemed and venerated Rabbi Meir Ashkenazi, seen here with Dad. Many were poor, small shopkeepers and professionals. And when they settled, World War II was beginning. Between 1939 and 41, the third wave of Jews, nearly 20,000 European refugees fleeing the horrors of Nazi persecution, also found a safe haven in Shanghai. My life in Shanghai was a series of contrasts. As Deborah mentioned earlier, an English colonial upbringing, servants, and I can share some funny anecdotes about them later, school uniforms, and afternoon tea. At home, it was traditionally observant. I recall coming home from services after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the holiest day of the year for Jews, in the car between grandfather, dressed in top hat, tails, and tennis shoes, and great-grandfather, dressed in a bowler hat, tux, and tennis shoes. It was not permitted to wear leather on Kippur, and one interpretation was that it came from an animal and cost its life. Most of the fond memories of my youth revolved around the celebration of the Jewish holidays at home. I lived through 3 wars in Shanghai. In 1932, the Sino-Japanese War. Then in 1937, Japan bombed Shanghai, and all the British women and children were evacuated to Hong Kong. Being British, Mummy, her mother, and who had come to live with us, and the 3 children, me, my sister, and baby brother, who was only 6 months old, among them. But one cannot escape one's destiny. Babushka, Mom's mother, on a shopping trip to town one day, was killed in a violent motor accident. So Mummy and the 3 of us children returned to Shanghai in the midst of the heaviest bombing. I can still see the bombs splashing by our ship as we entered harbor. I was only 8 then. These were terrible times in China. There was starvation in the land. I recall walking to school, sidestepping packages of straw in which dead Chinese babies were wrapped and collected each day. Also, I will never forget seeing a grown Chinese man gnawing the bark of a tree in hunger. One day, Dad took Richie and me to Nanking Road near the Bund, the business section of town, to witness the hordes of Chinese refugees streaming over our little garden bridge, with all their possessions on rickshaws and wheelbarrows. The next day we read that bombs had fallen just 10 minutes after we left on the exact spot where we had stood, killing many and demolishing 2 of our big department stores, Sincere and Wing On. I have never forgotten the lesson of the terrible effects of war. It left an indelible mark on my memory. On December 8th, 1941, 3 hours after Pearl Harbor. Excuse me. We were one day ahead. I'm losing my voice. Japan bombed and sank the HMS Petrel, a British naval gunboat in Chinese waters, and occupied Shanghai. Oh, thank you. The only thing it meant to me at the time was a day off from school. However, things got progressively worse as the years wore on. The Japanese considered all British and Americans as full enemies and required them to wear red armbands with a big B or A, and eventually interned them in camps for the duration of the war, many in our family among them. But on the whole, they were not physically threatened. The Iraqis, considered semi-enemies, were also required to wear armbands with an X, not interned, not allowed to work, nor allowed in public places such as parks, movies, or libraries. Some took their armbands off to go to a movie once in a while, but if they were caught, they'd be in great trouble. So the Iraqi Jews were really very much worse off. And I remember Granny having to sell her jewelry and personal possessions in order to maintain the family throughout the war. By some chance, my parents' passports had expired, so we ended up being stateless Chinese nationals and were not affected by these restrictions. Food was rationed, and my sister Richie, all of 14, volunteered to collect them each month. 25 pounds of rice, flour, and sugar, which she slung on the back of her bike, our only means of transportation in those days. And once, after a downpour, her bike skid, and all the rations for the month spilt on the wet pavement. Quite a family tragedy. However, on a lighter note, Richie also used to carry Granny on the back of her bike to her mahjong games. This is quite a historic picture. It is of my cousin Isa's 21st birthday. Mummy saved our meager rations for months for it. Isa, known as Cherry by his friends for Chernomorsky, was sent from Harbin to live with us. His mother was Mom's sister, because there was a rash of kidnappings of Jewish children, and also for his further education. There were no English schools in Harbin at that time. His best friend, Yosef Tekoa, who was Joe Tukachinsky in those days, here, my cousin Isa, me, and my sister Richie, and my kid brother on the floor there. Yosef Tekoa became Israel's ambassador to the UN and Russia, and the first president of Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, Israel. My cousin Joe Jacob, later known as Yosef Yaakov, was the head of the English language department of Kol Yisrael, Voice of Israel. And I recall in '57, when I was first there, the whole country stopped at 1 p.m. to listen to his broadcast news. He had a mellifluous baritone voice and looked and spoke like Jose Ferrar. He became part of the diplomatic corps and was assigned posts in Toronto and became consul, Israel consul in Washington, D.C. as well. My uncle Sam was the best soccer player, football player, we called it. And he was the captain of the Palestine football team. I was their mascot. He took me to every game, despite the chilblains that I suffered from our bitter cold winters. And then there was Benny Fishoff, right there. He came as a young man. Oh, I can't get him. There he is. At 14, he fled Europe after losing his whole family, totally penniless. He is now quite a wealthy tycoon and a very generous philanthropist, and has a family dynasty that is growing still. My sister Richie was allowed to the party only because she agreed to crank the gramophone and manually change the records after each dance on our beautiful parquet floors. Note the blackened tea kettle on our pipe stove. There was no central heating. Father's brothers spent the war years playing bridge. I think that's where I got my love for the game. We had blackouts should we be bombed by the Americans. By the time the sirens went off to warn us of an attack, it was usually over. The Japanese evacuated all the first floors of tall apartment buildings to store ammunition, and tenants above were not allowed to move out. It was common practice to use civilians as human shields even then. But the European Jewish refugees really suffered the most. They were confined to a ghetto in the industrial section of the city called Hongqiu, across the Huangpu River. And our little garden bridge with Broadway mansions in the background, owned by the Sassoons, used as a transitory center where many were housed upon arrival. They were only allowed out for work or school with individual passes issued at the whim of the Japanese, particularly one named Goya, who struck fear in all their hearts. This is an original sign stating stateless refugees are prohibited to pass without permission. The photo is courtesy of Gary Matzdorf. They lived under very primitive conditions for the duration of the war. No electricity nor gas to cook with, no running water, nor flush toilets. They had what was called honeypots, humorously named for its odor, and which were collected and sold to the farmers each day. We had to boil all our water and disinfected all our fruit and vegetables with something called potassium permanganate. They were magenta crystals that dissolved in water, and if you didn't do that, you were in deep trouble. Special soup kitchens, hospitals, schools, and lodging were set up by the local organizations. Members of the community, Dad among them, met each ship as they arrived, most with 2 suitcases and 10 Deutschmarks, which amounted to $2.50. Of the many who were brought home was a young man in his 20s by the name of Izzy Groudens. Here seen affixing the mezuzah for our new home. He too came via the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok and Japan with a Mir Yeshiva, who were housed in our Beth Aharon synagogue. He was among the fortunate few to have received a transit visa issued by the saintly Chiuni Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Lithuania, against his own government's directives. Rabbi Groudens remained a close friend of the family for over 70 years. Visas were not required to enter Shanghai, but needed to exit Europe. As Deborah mentioned earlier, it was only lately uncovered by Man Li Ho that her father, the Chinese consul in Vienna between 39 and 40, Dr. Ho Fengshan, also defying his superiors, was responsible for issuing numerous exit visas. He died in San Francisco in 1997, and none of us knew anything about him then. Both he and Sugihara were honored by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, as righteous among the nations, as was Oskar Schindler of Schindler's List fame. So it was that this small Jewish community that took 100 years to establish itself in an outpost called Shanghai restituted and rehabilitated nearly 20,000 of their fellow Jews fleeing the unspeakable horrors of Nazi Europe. We had no idea how bad it was, no inkling of the Holocaust, no crematoria. The enormity of the tragedy was only revealed by the Red Cross after the war in the Pacific ended, August of '45, 3 months after VE Day in Europe. Richie and I transferred from the British school to the Jewish school when the British teachers were interned. And when I graduated in December of '44, we had an elegant ball. Formal gowns, tuxedos, a band, and banquet. I am sure if we had any knowledge of how bad things were in Europe, this would never have been permitted. We were required to turn in all shortwave radios to the Japanese authorities and threatened with severe punishment if we didn't adhere to this edict. A cousin who owned a radio shop did so too, all except one. He was our only source of BBC News, and when asked if he ever heard about what was really happening to the Jews in Europe, he too confirmed that it was never mentioned. Among the first American GIs to enter Shanghai after the war was one Chaplain Alvin Fine. He asked to meet the president of the Sephardic community, my father at the time, for permission to use the Ohel Rachel Synagogue on Friday nights for the Jewish servicemen, following our regular services. And that's how we first met him. He was a guest at our home on a number of occasions. He later became the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel here in San Francisco, where I got my first job in America. He didn't remember me, but he did my father. That's him. If anybody ever heard any of his sermons, they will never forget his mellifluous voice and the charm of the man. D-Day for us, departure. My sister Richie and I left home on student visas to the States in May of '45 on the SS General Gordon, a converted American Army transport. It took 17 days. We docked a day in Honolulu. Most everyone on board were allowed off, excepting the two of us, due to our Chinese stateless status. The Jewish community, we're seen here with the president, even offered to put up a bond for us, but to no avail. The American immigration must have felt threatened by the two teenagers. Needless to say, we spent a miserable day alone on board. And when we arrived in San Francisco and sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge, we were surprised to see it was orange. And we had never seen so many white faces. The next day, being Shabbat, our Sabbath, we went to Magen David, the only Sephardic synagogue, where my sister met her husband-to-be, Joe Safdie, our first day in America. You might say she was shanghaied. Their wedding, and 50 years later. We celebrated over 60 years here, where we too found a haven. In 1949, our parents and brother Jack fled Shanghai with 2 suitcases each on the last flight out as the Chinese communists entered the city. Since Dad was a factory owner and considered a capitalist, he would have been held hostage. They didn't even have time to say goodbye to Granny, Dad's mother. They fled to Hong Kong, but as they were stateless, were not permitted to remain for more than 2 days by the then British authorities. What to do and where to go. Fortunately, Macau, which was an open Portuguese port on the mainland across the China Sea, had no such restrictions, and they lived there as the only Jews for 18 years. It would be 20 years until we'd see our father again. Chaim Herzog, a former president of Israel, once visited Macau and asked to meet the Jewish community. He was directed to my father. Years later, I found his card in one of Dad's prayer books. In 1948, the State of Israel was established. In 1949, Granny and most of the stateless Jewish community who had not fled to other countries all went to Israel. It took them 51 days on the SS Worcester Victory via South Africa, where they docked for a day. They too were not allowed off. The entire Jewish community came out to greet them with food, flowers, and fruit. At a recent lecture in Israel, I met an 80-year-old woman who said she was 18 then and was among them. They had to sail via Cape Town and the Mediterranean because Egypt was already at war with Israel and closed the Suez Canal to them. They slept in a hold stacked with 3 tiers of hammocks for 51 days. Many had a hard time straightening up. I once asked Granny how she had managed. She said there was austerity in the land and food was strictly rationed. They were placed in tent cities called Ma'abarot. And these tents were British Army surplus, and I don't know why it was dark green in color. So in summer, it absorbed the heat and was absolutely unbearable. You couldn't remain in one. And in winter, it was cold, and when it rained, they had something called bots, which was mud that turned to clay and absolutely impossible to walk in. So what an adjustment from the life of luxury she had led. Upon arrival, many of whom belonged to Beitar, a Jewish youth organization, were drafted into the army, briefly trained, and proudly marched in Israel's 10th anniversary parade. That's Granny. She lit one match in the morning and chain smoked the rest of the day. She also liked to nip a bit. So when family came and we brought her her Hennessy brandy, she exchanged 1 bottle for 2 Israeli Carmel brandy that took her through a few days. She lived a ripe old age. She said she wouldn't die young, and she didn't. When these boys arrived, they were taken into the army, and I was in Israel in 1957, so the summer of 58, as a Hadassah youth leader for Young Judea. I was so proud to see my cousin Dan march in Israel's 10th anniversary parade. I shudder to think if the timing was reversed, if the Chinese communists occupied Shanghai before May of 48, where would they all have fled? And no place to go. A difference of less than a year, another miracle. And so to conclude, why Shanghai? I truly believe the Sephardic community was placed there specifically to receive and help our co-religionists from all 3 migrations. First their own from Baghdad, then Russia, and lastly Europe. And when that master plan was fulfilled, dispersed. We are indebted to China for her open door policy and tolerance, where we all found a safe haven. Jajanu in Shanghainese, thank you. So, like a comet that streaked through the sky and vanished, so it was of our Jewish community. Not a single soul remained. 100 years to come full circle. We did not realize what a turbulent and historic time we had lived through. However, we did take with us many mixed memories of a most unique and miraculous life. Thank you. Yes, I will be happy to answer any questions. Before that, I was wondering, maybe we'll take a few questions, but I didn't touch at all upon our relationship with the Chinese community and our servants. So if you'd like some funny stories, I'll be happy to share them with you. You'd like that rather? Yes? Okay. You can come up to me later and ask the questions you want to. Our servants. Our cook is sitting in the center. He was the best Sephardic chef par excellence. We had an old ama who decided to retire one day. And she said, "Missy, I go, but no worry," this in Pidgin English, and that's how we communicated. "I send you a nice young girl." And sure enough, 2 weeks later, this gorgeous gal rang our bell, and the cook opened the door and promptly fell in love with her. However, the problem was he was married and had 3 children. So our problems began. The wife used to threaten them with an axe, and Dad had to run down in his PJs in the middle of the night to stop it. And that went on for quite a while. The ama on the right, the term ama means a nursemaid, and really she was assigned to the children specifically. And you can see the wife on the left. You can understand why the cook fell in love with his concubine. She eventually became his concubine and also bore him 3 children. These are the shoes of my ama, the old ama, who had bound feet. The practice of bound feet took 1,000 years until it was banned in 1911 by the Sung dynasty. They claim it was for beauty purposes that the feet were bound, but I really believe it was to prevent the women from straying. To bind the feet, they started at 3 or 5 and broke the bones and bound them. I couldn't even fit my wrist, which is seen on the bottom left there, into the shoe. My father in his factory with his 2 secretaries. He manufactured silk stockings for women, primarily Chinese women with a size 4 foot. I never had any to wear. I did a lot of crying. He thought he'd solve the problem by adding toes and tops, but it didn't really work. The man in the center, Jung Sung, I remember him from my infancy. He was the foreman of the factory, and his son on the left. Well, when I left Shanghai, I remembered Yun Sung looking exactly like his son. So when they came, I addressed the son. He said, "No, no, no. Leah, you must come Shanghai. No worry. I give you half my pension, and you're very rich. You can teach English on the side." I didn't take him up on it, I'm afraid. A wonderful man, and today I have a 4th generation relationship with his son, and who recently his wife gave birth to a boy, so that's another grandson. I'll wait with this one, the beautiful bund. Some people call it bund. Please don't. It's incorrect. It's bund. It was derived from an Indian name meaning wharf. The buildings on the Bund were built by the Sephardic. 30% of the stately buildings were built by the Sephardic community. And they are quite lavish. If I may, I'd like to go back and talk about a little incident with our cook. He was lent by my mother for a couple of weeks to friends visiting from Japan. And when he came back, we were so curious to know how it went. And he was so unhappy, and we asked him why. Did they not pay you? No, Missy. Did they beat you? No, Missy. So what's the problem? He said, they mixed all the milk and meat. He was only used to cooking in a kosher home. He would not let us into his kitchen. So when I went back, I had never been inside a kitchen in my life. So when I went back, the kitchen was rather small, and I just wondered, how did he make those beautiful banquets in such a small space? Our days often began by my father calling his factory associate, Mr. Wong. And it went like this: Mr. Wong, are you dying today? Of course, he meant the stockings. And the same Mr. Wong once came for dinner with his wife, and leaving, he turns around to my parents and he says, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and my wife's bottom too. Since we were an observant home, many of the guests in our home were observant too, because there were no kosher restaurants available, so they were always asked home. And if it was evening, they would turn to my father and simply asked 2 words: which way? Would anyone dare a guess what they were asking? Someone once said, the restrooms. That too sometimes. However, it was which way should they face to say their evening prayers towards Jerusalem. And of course, in Shanghai, they had to face west. I don't know if any of you know that Jerusalem is mentioned 349 times in the Bible. Zion, another word for Jerusalem, 108. Can anyone guess how many times it's mentioned in the Quran? Not once. So that's my little plug for Jerusalem. We didn't really have to go to school. Our education was really expanded at the dinner table. We had guests from all over the world. It was really an international help me. Community. Thank you. And I'd like to end with the dreidel. Do you all know what a dreidel is? It's really a top that is spun and played in Hanukkah, one of the holidays, minor holidays. And on it, does anyone know what it says? Nes Gadol Haya Sham. A great miracle happened there. Of course, in Israel, it's Haya Po, happened here. Now, if you transpose one of the letters from the last to the first, do you know what it says? Shanghai. So a great miracle really happened there. I really want to thank you all so much for coming.